Wait for it, and we're live. Hey, all you crazy sci-fi and fantasy fans, it's time for your daily dose of shenanigans over here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. Just a couple of nerdy veterans and one chaos coordinator geeking out over our science fiction passions and fantastical fantasies. A place where magic is king, the sky is the limit, and space is the place. We are the podcast that puts the fun in dysfunction. So without further ado, we have a returning friend of the show, Mr. Rick Shaw. Can you introduce yourself to our listeners and viewers at home?
Thank you, sir. Appreciate being invited back. Rick Shaw, retired professional geek, started writing novels about 10 years ago. Hit publish indie for the first time 2 years ago. I have 3 novels out. 4th is in the works.
Okay. That is quite the pace that you're setting for yourself. Sleep, who needs it, right?
I'll sleep when I'm dead.
There you go. All right. And because this is the next part of the introduction, I always forget is how we found him. So we actually met Rick through the Listeners of the Dead Robot Society. Although I think that's the group. I think the podcast is just the Dead Robot Society, but it's a podcast for authors about authoring. And so we've been engaging probably for years because I found that podcast back in 2015 and you were listening then. Pretty sure.
I was at that time I had a commute, an hour's drive each direction, and DRS was part of the rotation to fill the drive.
Which would mean we've been communicating online for almost a decade.
Almost.
Holy crap. That's a long time. Okay. So because this is the Blasters Blades podcast, we do have to do the religion question. So are you ready for that?
Bring it.
All right. Stargate, Babylon 5, or Battlestar Galactica?
Oh, I like the old school Battlestar Galactica, but I got to go Stargate.
Okay. All are acceptable answers. What is it about Stargate?
I like the fantastical nature of it, the science behind the potential of a controllable wormhole, and the integration of the Egyptian mythology.
Okay. So are you referring to the movie or the TV series then? Because they went past Egypt in the series.
Well, they still integrate the Egyptian gods when you start talking about Anubis and Horus. But no, love the movie. The movie's on the annual rotation in the Shawshack.
Here too. Now I've got to introduce the kid to the visual crack. Get them addicted too, right? Share your suffering. I mean, your love. The Battlestar Galactica, I like that one too. I haven't made it through the old one. I need to get around to buying the box set, but bought the box set years ago, and it was like for however many DVDs it was, but it was just like no breaks per episode. It was just all one long block, which would make it very difficult to track if you just want to watch an episode a night kind of thing.
Yeah.
Because I've got to remember I'm on DVD minute mark because they didn't break it up by episode. And whoever thought that was a good idea should be shot. Metaphorically.
At least beaten about the head and shoulders with their own arm.
Yes. So yeah, I like all of those though. I don't have as much time behind the Babylon 5. I've seen like the first 5 episodes, I think. It is one of those ones I want to get the box set because I was watching a couple of those on like YouTube because they're free, or I think Pluto's the other free platform that they'll get rights to. And the commercials are annoying as all get up. So it might be worth it because once I know you like it, it's sometimes worth it just to buy the DVDs so you can just watch it without interruption.
Yeah, I've sat through a handful of episodes of Babylon 5, and I just never caught the bug.
I mean, surprisingly, some of it ages well as far as storytelling, but I think we're judging it on a bar that's been dropped to the floor because modern storytelling on the big screen is so crappy that when you see anyone who actually seems to care about a plot, it already makes it like heads and shoulders above what we got right now. So yeah, I don't know. It's on there though. Although, we cut the cable cord because it was expensive. It was getting too expensive. So we went to streaming because we could watch what we wanted and no interruption with commercials. And now we pay more for the various streaming platforms and we still have commercials again. So at this point, I'm like, either give me back cable or I'm buying the box set because it's ridiculous.
Yeah, we were all set to cut the cable, and then My wife's 94-year-old dad moved in with us, and the level of intricacy to sort out the streaming channels and the manual dexterity with the remote was just too much for him. So we went back to cable so that he could get through the things he wants to get through.
Okay. I don't even know what would be on cable anymore because I haven't had it for over a decade.
Oh, he does. I mean, his stuff's real pedestrian. Evening news, football, and PBS.
I think when I started looking at cutting the cable, Netflix was still mailing you the DVDs. So it's been a little bit.
While.
Yeah. I wonder if they could do that in places that don't have good Wi-Fi.
No, they stopped shipping DVD altogether.
They did. At one point in time, they did both.
No, they stopped shipping DVD, I want to say a couple of years ago now.
Interesting. All right. And because we are polytheistic here at the Blasters and Blades podcast, Legend of the Seeker, which is the Sword of Truth book series, Merlin, or Earthsea, which is also in book form, The Legend of the Earthsea.
I know of the 2-book series. I like the legends surrounding Merlin and the Arthurian myth, but I don't subscribe to any particular book or series. Although pregame I did mention that I liked the casting of Merlin as a brief character in the Sorcerer's Apprentice movie with Nick Cage and that group. So, which will probably get some folks throwing stones at me.
It's, hey, whatever. It's, you like what you like. We try not to yuck other people's yums. I've used some of the Arthurian legend in one of the short stories I did. Oh, it's in one of my own anthologies, but there's so much fertile ground there that just the sky's the limit with your imagination on the cool things you could do.
And the Sorcerer's Apprentice takes the Merlin storyline with Morgan Le Fay, and uses that in warfare with Merlin's apprentices and the conflict between them, and Nick Cage's actor finding another apprentice to bring into the fold. It's a fun movie. It's a Disney flick. It's very light. It's a lot of fun.
I have to check that out. I haven't seen that one. In fact, let me write that down. Let's see. Merlin's Apprentice?
Sorcerer's Apprentice.
All right.
Alfred Molina in it.
Okay.
Yeah, faces that you will recognize.
Has it held up well? Have you watched it recently?
Oh, yeah, no, it holds up. It holds up. That's on the almost yearly cycle. We probably hit that about every 18 months.
Is it family friendly?
Oh, very.
Well, I mean, I used to assume Disney was family friendly, but they've started doing more mature casting as they bought so many of the other smaller franchises that you just can't assume.
Deadpool just made the first R rating in the Marvel universe.
That's why I'm like, you look at some of what they're doing, and you can't just assume that if it's got the Disney logo that it means family friendly anymore.
Sure.
And I get they're branching out. I just wish they'd kept they hadn't crossed the stream so you could, for branding's sake, you could know, okay, if it's got this on it, the little castle, it's automatically okay for my kids.
Sure. Well, if you remember the original Sorcerer's Apprentice with Mickey,
yeah,
the animated one,
I do.
There's an homage to it in this, where the new Sorcerer's Apprentice loses control of all of the mops and brooms and water trying to clean up his lab.
Nice.
So it's good stuff.
All right. And because this is the Blasters Blades podcast, and you've already told us your favorite dinosaur, we've got a new one for you. Are you ready for this?
Sure.
What is your favorite zoo animal?
My favorite zoo animal? Oh, that's easy. His name is George, and he's a rhinoceros at the Hogle Zoo.
At what zoo?
At the Hogle Zoo. That's the zoo in Salt Lake City. My niece is a zookeeper, and my wife and I went to visit a couple of years ago. We got a behind-the-scenes tour, and George and I became buddies. I got to feed George.
Okay.
Pictures of me feeding George and my wife feeding Princess, the other rhino.
Okay. I'll have to look that up. I haven't been to a zoo in years, but now maybe you have to make a field trip.
I'll make a note. I'll IM you one of the pictures. It's a hoot. George is a sweet big animal.
Yeah, it's one of the things that what do you call it? Are you familiar with Curiosity Stream?
I am.
So one of the things that they did was they did the Life After Humans series.
Yep.
And yeah, it's basically, if you haven't listened, dear listener, Curiosity Stream is a streaming platform much like Netflix, but it's all documentaries. It is in my family we jokingly call it Nerdflix, but it's a lot of fun. I dig documentaries. They got everything from science to natural sciences to sci-fi, or science, I guess, and the science behind sci-fi. I will warn you to check if you're going to watch. You can't just assume documentary means family friendly, because some of the ones, when they're doing the history ones, if they were topless back then, they'll show actresses portraying it sans clothing, which as an adult, I really don't care. But when I want my kids to watch it, I'm like, I get that they wouldn't have worn that, but could you just throw something on them so we could let our kids watch this and learn things? But
all 4 of my boys are adults.
Yeah. So, but with that out of the way,
3 to 24. So
quite a span. But with that out of the way, so the Life After Humans basically assumes like on day one, snap, all the humans just disappear, not a gradual decline. And if you took all of humans off the planet, what happens? And it focuses on like how quickly nature reclaims like developed land. And it was a lot quicker than I thought it would be.
That was a series on,
I think PBS did it.
The History Channel back in the late aughts. I want to say 08 or 09.
So when I watched it, it was all, it looked like it could have been episodic, but it was all smashed together in one viewing, and I saw it on Curiosity Stream, so maybe they only licensed it. But if you check it out, it's called Life After Humans. I recommend it to everybody. But it surprised me of how many of our niche dog breeds would just die out because they were bred for a specific purpose, and if they don't have that purpose nearby, they just get eaten by larger animals. A lot of the ankle biters are dead.
Oh yeah, no, they're bait. I take advantage of some of that in the current novel I'm writing, where in Genesis alone, the primary character ends up literally alone in Saskatchewan, and comes across an abandoned farm, and is mauled by one of the 2 mastiffs there, and then the other, he befriends him. And mastiffs were bred as hunting dogs, so I suspect they will survive quite nicely.
Basically, all the little dogs are doomed. The medium dogs, it's a crapshoot because not all medium dogs were created equal, and all the large dogs mostly would survive. I think they said the greyhounds would have a struggle just because they already have rather short lives compared to other dogs.
Yeah, but they're quick.
Yeah, but that also burns a lot of energy.
Yep. So
you would end up with, basically mutt type large dogs would become packs, and it would be, they basically one step to wolves at that point. So it's really interesting, but they cover like what happens to the Hoover Dam and all the nuclear power plants. Although most of the nuclear power plants have electronic fail-safes, so the power would last long enough for them to shut themselves off.
Well, but those rods don't go cold straight away. They take many, many years to go cold. So then you've got water circulating by convection, and hopefully the plumbing holds together and we don't get, a failure in the plumbing and then a meltdown from that.
True, but at that point in time, like it would be because when the rods, or when they close themselves off, when they do the shutdown, even if the water stops working because that's part of the shutdown process, it would still contain it enough that it would make it a localized issue, not a nuclear explosion level of issue. So we're talking couple square miles around it only.
Well, but in California, 2 of the big nuclear plants are on the coast, which means then you get meltdown that then pollutes the sea for potentially thousands of miles or hundreds of miles up and down the coast.
True, but then the question is, as the liquid gets diversified, so you have a thinner layer of it, would it be enough to cause as much of a problem because it dilutes? I don't know. I am not a nuclear biologist or scientist of any kind.
Neither am I. I just did some reading on it as part of my writings.
Yeah, if you want to get really depressed, look at the map of the various tonnages of nuclear bombs, and you type in your zip code, and it shows you like what it looks like. I'm near too many military bases. I'm just effed. You guys will all
an hour from Edwards.
You guys will all suffer. I will just be gone and cavorting with factories or whatever you do.
I'm an hour from Edwards. I'm 3 hours from Vandenberg. We'll get hammered.
But yeah, it's interesting to see, like, because the post-apoc stuff, at one point in time I did some ghostwriting where I wrote some of those novels, and so you look at all kinds of random things, like the deserts out in the Utah, Nevada area. Like most of those deserts will link all back together and just be one massive desert, because some of that greenification that's there can't happen if humans aren't there to keep forcing it and forcing water back in.
Absolutely.
Because what you end up having is humans visit, like Nevada, for instance, they visit Las Vegas. They drink water that's brought in. They either dump the water out from their showers, they excrete it out from various orifices, but then it gets inserted into the aquifer there, and you end up creating a cycle that will go away the minute humans aren't there to keep forcing it.
Yep.
And you'll end up with a dust bowl, much like we saw in the Great Depression.
Oh, absolutely.
So it's interesting because, like I said, I've written short stories where I had to do research on what happens to all those areas. It is quite grim.
Southern California hits the same thing. Southern California is effectively a temperate coastal desert. And without irrigation and the import of water, Mulholland did all of the water import for LA, stealing it from the Owens Valley and the Central Valley and other areas. Eventually, if humans go away or whatever happens and that infrastructure goes away, Southern California reverts to a coastal desert.
And the other part of that is what happens to all those. We're going far afield, but it's fun, so we'll go with it, and then we'll get under your book in a few minutes.
Sure.
But if you do that, then some of the rivers that we intentionally diverted for agriculture, or because they're stealing it from agriculture and the local populations to give to the big cities, because the big cities are where the people are congregated, which means they have the voting power in the state, and they can basically tell the rural folk to F themselves because they outvote them. When that's not there, I wonder if the rivers divert back to their natural course, or if the damage is done.
Well, I mean, if you look at the Owens River Valley, I think it would ultimately revert to its own run. The Kern River Valley coming out of Sequoia Kings Canyon, it goes to ground in the middle of the Central Valley, but without man to divert it to Shaver Lake and some of the other components. The Central Valley in California at one point was an inland sea, and is an inland sea in the Nevin co-authored book, Lucifer's Hammer.
Okay.
That happens as a result of a comet strike and a tsunami, but again, it becomes an inland sea again. The Colorado is an interesting case because it's been dammed several times with Hoover and Powell and some of the others. But eventually those dams will fail without maintenance. And the Colorado just runs its course down to the Gulf of California, or Baja, and out into the ocean there. It'd be interesting to kind of map some of that stuff. They did recently. There was an effort in Oregon to remove all the dams off the Klamath River. The Klamath. Is that right? I think that's the right one. To facilitate the salmon spawning and stuff. The dams have been put in for flood control, and there are other mechanisms for it now. And it's been interesting watching, the rivers return to their natural course. If you look at there are a couple of good documentaries about Yellowstone and the reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone and its ecosystem. And the rivers there have returned to their original course because the deer are no longer overpopulating and overgrazing. They're now being hunted by predators. So that changes the whole balance. It's really an interesting thing to research.
Yeah, that's one of the things when you get people that are kind of anti-hunting and they get a little too, they want to support nature and be environmentalists or whatever term they might use for themselves, but then they don't realize that by stopping some of the intervention, they are preventing nature's healing of itself, because it's a delicate balance. And if you get rid of the apex predator, the wolf, because they're dangerous to humans, then the deer overspawn or overproduce, not spawn, spawning's for fish, but they will overproduce, which means they'll overgraze, which means it causes damage to the forest. And then they end up starving in a larger population than you want, because there's no food. Whereas if you have natural predators, it keeps them in balance so they don't overpopulate, and then they don't overgraze so they don't starve, and it kind of balances it out. That's why I try to go with the term conservationalist at this point, because I'm enough of a Boy Scout. I grew up under the leave it better than you found it kind of attitude towards camping.
Yes.
And as you look, more and more of those terms that would involve, like, I just want to care for the planet we live on, have become so political that you kind of constantly got to find new words to say, but basically, like, let's just not damage stuff or break what we don't understand.
Yeah. And leave it in a condition that our kids and grandkids can use it.
Yeah, it's interesting to see some of that, but I don't know. Nowadays, nobody really wants to go out into nature, so I wonder if it's healing itself without human campers. Because when I was a kid, we couldn't wait to go out into the woods, and now it's like they can't wait to get to the Xbox or whatever, and it's like, don't you just want to go outside and see what the sun looks like?
I'm old enough to appreciate some of those memes that my alarm for coming in was the streetlights coming on. Turned us loose, threw us outside, and said, come back at dark. And if my parents knew how far afield we ranged on our bicycles, they would have probably been shocked.
We did the same thing. We had woods near our house, and we thought it'd be a good idea to like throw rocks at each other because they were hand grenades as we played soldier. Many a bumps and bruises from that.
Many a welt from BB rifles.
So I lived in a military town, so like gun safety was something to sort of beat into our heads, so we didn't see that as much. But the idea of throwing rocks because we pretended they were grenades, that was a thing, because why not? It's always weird when you drive through a neighborhood now. I remember when you drive through, it would be like somebody would scream game on, and you'd run out, and then you run clear the street for them to go by, and then you run back to the street to play soccer or catch or whatever. Street football, hockey, whatever it was, street sports. And you could hear the kids singing car game on, right? Like, you don't see that anymore.
My folks bought a condo north of Santa Barbara back in '74. And the condo complex was literally at the edge of the world when they bought it. We could go out the back gate and it was empty field all the way to the beach, a 15, 20-minute walk. And if you got about halfway and you took a right, it was all eucalyptus groves and full of monarch butterflies. And you built forts, and there were little creeks, and you had rope swings. And it was so much of that now is gone with development and expansion out in that area. Anyway.
Yeah, it's the world is changing. It'll be interesting to see what it looks like in another 20, 50 years, assuming we live that long. But hey, don't worry. The Motel 6 on Mars will keep the light on for us.
That's what I've heard.
Yeah, Musk is going to take us there, I'm convinced. And if not him, the space race has been interesting. China's been doing some stuff up in space lately, and so is India.
I've been watching it with great interest. I was the 7-year-old kid laying in the middle of the living room floor, watching Armstrong and Aldrin step off the lander on a 9-inch black and white fuzzy screen. And I have been hooked by it ever since. I actually got to get my space nerd on at the end of July for the first time. I had never been to the Space Coast. I went to Orlando on business and took a personal day while I was there and paid for the behind the scenes tour, and got to visit pads 39A and 39B and a bunch of the other spaces. And it was just, I was a kid again. I bought my, did my bit for the tourism industry there, and had an absolute blast.
So Hampton has a Air and Space Museum, which is kind of cool to go to. I try to go there periodically. If you buy the family plan, I think a 4th or 5th visit, it's paid for itself. And you get the free IMAX movie. So it's all the 3D nature documentaries, which are kind of cool because you can almost experience like places you could never go to just because, budgets are real. So like, they've got drones that'll have gone through the Grand Canyon or the Everglades or, just various nature places that depending on where you live, you might not get to reasonably see. So it's amazing, but they've done some pretty cool talks where they had, various people in the space, I guess, business environment, whatever. I don't know the right term, but people that have worked in that industry at various points have come and given talks. So it turns out there's that movie that came out about the black women that were the mathematicians that helped.
The calculators and skirts.
Yes.
The story about Katherine Johnson and company.
So one of the ladies, and I can't remember what, because it's been a couple years, but one of the ladies that was part of that group actually was from Hampton. And so before she would, at one point in time, she came to speak there. I don't know if she's still alive, but it was just interesting to hear people that were there at the time. One of the Apollo engineers who was on ground control for it, he spoke at RavenCon in 2015. And I asked him after, because, if you wait, you can get one-on-one time at the end because everyone rushes out to the next thing. So I started asking him afterwards. I'm like, so when did the conspiracy theories start that you faked the moon landing? And he goes, JR, my mother-in-law called me as soon as I got home and wanted to know how we faked it. And I'm like, that quick. He's like, I don't know if it was that quick for everyone or she just didn't like me. I'm like, well, mother-in-law jokes are there for a reason, right?
Oh.
But
my maternal grandfather worked for Douglas Aircraft from the 1940s on. He started out in Cleveland working for Doug Sr. and was part of the crew that opened the Douglas Aircraft facilities in the San Fernando Valley. And when he passed, I got all of his longevity pins and all of his lapel pins from all the projects that he worked on. And one of them is an Apollo pin.
Nice.
With the Saturn V on it. He was part of a number of really interesting projects. In his files, I found paperwork for patents things that he developed for Douglas Aircraft that became company property because he was working for them at the time, like a certain type of rivet for fast assembly of the Dauntless dive bomber during the war. My dad served in the South Pacific with VMF 223 at Guadalcanal. That's the fighter squadron that was there. The dive bomber squadron that was there had Dauntless dive bombers, and my dad got voluntold to play tail gunner in them more than once. So follow that circle around to the early 1970s when my grandfather is introduced to someone who flew in the back of aircraft he built during the war.
Wow. So I've heard some stories from my grandfather that he was in World War II as well, but for him it was he was in the infantry in the army and he did the D-Day landing, and then he made it from D-Day all the way to he got wounded at St. Lo.
Oh man, I have most respect for the men that hit that beach.
I think most of the movies are about Omaha, and he landed on Utah, if I remember correctly. I could be getting it worse or wrong. It was the opposite beach of the one Saving Private Ryan was filmed on. I remember that came up in the family when that movie came out. So
yeah, Saving Private Ryan hit Omaha, I think.
So then it would have been you. He was on the opposite one. So it's either
Juneau and Gold were the other two that were American beaches, I believe.
I think Utah was an American one too, but it's been years since I looked at it. But yeah, he landed on one of the ones that wasn't on Saving Private Ryan. It's been years since I've checked. I just know he landed on D-Day and he made it to St. Lo, and that's where he met my grandma. Love at first stitch because she was one of the nurses at the bases they sent him back to in England.
Nice.
She was one of the American nurses there.
Nice.
It's crazy how many of those GIs ended up getting married to those nurses.
It is. I can give you two interesting stories along that same storyline. My college and graduate school mentor, John Bonstead, his family immigrated from Germany to Panama in the 30s because they had cut off immigration for Jews from Germany to the United States. So Dad was a journalist, so they went to Panama and then later came from Panama to the States. When John turned 17, he enlisted. And because he was a natural German speaker, he was part of the occupation army back in Germany post-war. He was in Bavaria, met his wife Frida, and brought her back. And wonderful, wonderful gentleman, and phenomenal historian. The other story that runs that same kind of cycle, my mom's baby brother did a tour in Nam, came home, did ranger school, spent some time in southern Africa, in Rhodesia, fighting with the Rhodesian light infantry as an instructor and in the bush. During his time in country in Nam, was injured, met a nurse, looped around, crossed paths with her again in Germany post-war, looped around, crossed paths with her again at the VA in Santa Monica. They finally started dating. They ultimately got married. And then Johnny lost a fight with, I think it was liver cancer, Agent Orange related. But he and Debbie went around the block several times as a result of having met at a MASH in Nam.
So I just did a Google search, and it was Omaha Beach my grandfather landed on. So
okay.
Out of St. Lo. And was that the one that Saving Private Ryan was set at?
I think so, yes.
I know he wasn't the first wave. I think he was the second or third, his unit, if I remember correctly. I know it wasn't the first one because those boys took a serious beating.
They did.
That first one.
The actor, Charles Durning, was part of the first wave. And he had some interesting stories before he passed. I saw a couple of presentations where he talked about that. The actor Jimmy Doohan, who played Scotty in Star Trek,
right,
was part of the Canadian wave that hit one of the beaches.
Okay.
And on, I think it was his second day or third day, had one of his fingers shot off.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. There are some interesting connections with the D-Day cycle specifically, and some really interesting, very talented actors. And they've had some very interesting stories to tell.
Yeah, some of the I'm trying to think. Malcolm Churchill, I think was the guy's name. There was one, Fighting Jack Churchill or Mad Jack. I think he's the one who famously landed on D-Day with his sword, like old school. I'd have to check it. It was a basket. I just did a quick Google. It was a basket-hilted Scottish broadsword, and he brought his pipes with him.
Nice.
They had on the recent last year, 2024 reunion of the D-Day landing. They actually had one of the guys playing a set of bagpipes for the commemoration of the landing that his grandfather had carried with the Black Watch.
Oh, nice.
And they've just been passed down because those tend to be family heirlooms that you pass on. Even if the person doesn't play, they pass it on.
Oh, absolutely.
So the bagpipes that hadn't been played because his dad didn't play, but his granddad did. So when he finally inherited those pipes, the first time they were played again was at the commemoration of when his grandfather had played them on D-Day. So
I love pipe music. One of my bucket list things is the Royal Tattoo in Edinburgh in August one year. There's a pipe martial music festival in August in Edinburgh every year, on the parade grounds of Edinburgh Castle.
Yeah, I've seen some of those.
Oh, that's on my bucket list.
Worth the trip. But yeah, so anyway, it's crazy. Some of those World War II stories that really happened, if you look at those incidences and you find those stories, but then if you took those stories and you wrote them in a book, your editors would be like, that's not realistic, JR. That would never happen. I'm like, au contraire. Funny how
you betcha.
It's funny how sometimes reality is stranger than the fiction we come up with. And if you try to put reality in the fiction, they're going to be like, no, that would never happen.
Oh, yeah, it does.
I had one of those in my first book. My publisher for that one, Tim Taylor, was like, yeah, JR, you got to take this stuff out. Nobody's going to believe it. And I'm like, this happened to me. What are you talking about? He's like, I don't care. No one's going to believe it. Take it out. So anyway, well, we've been gabbing about World War II history nerd stuff. They do say when you turn 30, you have a decision to make. You either get obsessed with grilling things or history. I was obsessed with both before, so I think I'm good. I avoided that midlife crisis mostly by already being obsessed with both.
Yep. Nope. I have a grill on the patio, and I've been obsessed with World War II history since I was a teen.
Yeah.
Of course, having a dad who served in the South Pacific had something to do with that.
And the same thing, I grew up hearing Grandpa's stories about, World War II. And he didn't always tell the combat stories, but he mostly would tell like just the funny incidences about, this private or that corporal. Or
I couldn't get my dad to talk about combat experience until I was in my mid-20s. I was taking a graduate seminar and in military history, and the term assignment was interview a combat vet.
Okay.
And I called my dad and said, Dad, here's my assignment. And my choices are you or one of Mom's brothers, the two uncles. One flew UH-1s with the Air Cav, and the other did a tour, talked his way into a special forces unit behind the lines, and did his tour behind the lines in that unit before rotating home and then going to Ranger School. And my dad said, okay, it's time. And he and Mom came up for a weekend, and I set up a tape recorder, and I've got 3.5 hours. Did my research. I pulled unit pictures. I had sequence and unit notes from his unit and the bomber squadron and the sequences from the Mud Marines. And I've got this running conversation with him of, yep, no, I remember this. I remember that. I remembered him. His was the fighter I worked on. I remember the night he didn't come home, all of that stuff. And it is absolute gold.
So that what you're describing is from, as a trained historian, we call that oral history, and it's
Yes,
important
it
to be
is.
recorded. Oral history is different than just someone telling war stories, because as like what you did, you have to actually research and back up, and you can't just have someone say, I was here. You have to find like orders and documentation to support the story.
I have my dad's service record. Paid a guy to build my dad's service record because his records were part of the fire in the 70s in St. Louis. I don't know if you know about that.
I do, because the PTSD group I'm in at the VA has a lot of non-vets, because the tip of the spear is still, the tooth to tail ratio is?
Yeah.
Okay, so in case you guys don't know, tooth to tail is however many people it takes in a rear doing support stuff, so beans and bullets, etc. It takes to keep one fighting man in the field. It's still 1 to 12 roughly.
My camera's wigging out on me.
It does not like you, or it's a pacifist. I don't know.
I'm going to do this and see if it'll reset itself.
But
There we go.
So if you look at the amount of people that actually deploy, and then of those people that actually deploy to a combat zone, the amount that actually see combat, it gets infinitely smaller and smaller. We're talking about a fractional percentage of fractional percentages. And so if you find people that see a lot of action, especially when it's a policing operation and wasn't as heavy all the time, depending on when and where you were, in order to find support groups for some of the Iraq vets from the early war, they put us in with the Vietnam guys. And so, it's because of that, I heard all about like the records fire and in St. Louis, where the VA records and the Department of the Defense's records were stored. They're going to have another problem.
I have a PDF of my dad's service record. I don't think my dad will mind me telling this out of turn. He failed to qualify with both rifle and pistol. He only qualified with bayonet coming out of Parris Island, which is why they made him an engine mechanic. Dad enlisted in November of 1941. He was at Parris Island for Pearl Harbor.
Okay. I enlisted. I had a high enough ASVAB that they wanted me to go nuke, but I'm like, colorblind. Hello, that's not happening. Even if the ASVAB score would get me there, you'd wash me out the minute I did the nuke engineer physical, right? But when you have a high ASVAB, they want to fill you in like all the hard to fill MOSs. They give them bonuses, and I'm like, no, I want to shoot guns and play with explosives. They do not like to hear that if you have an ASVAB above the 50% tier, right? They want to throw you in a tech trade.
I had a 98 on my ASVAB.
Yeah, I did too. I think
and I got the Navy wanted to put me in a sub, and I went, no.
So I did. Trying to think. I think it was in '98. I don't know. It's been a lot of years since then for me. But I enlisted as a watercraft operator, thinking, gunboats, because that was the unit I was enlisting in. Found out the unit I enlisted into shut down in 1974. Nobody told the Army. It had only been 20 years. And so they sent me to truck driving school, and I can't back up an 18-wheeler to save my life. But I can shoot really good. And so the Army said, you know what? Welcome to the infantry, kid. And that's where I spent 8.5 years. So you were in the military. You were in the Navy, right?
I was Air Force.
Oh, Air Force. Okay.
The Navy kept trying to put me in a sub, and I went, nope. And I walked across the hall. Well, first I was going to go Corps, and my dad went, nope, you're too smart for the Corps. Don't do that. So then I went and talked to the Navy, and the recruiter was going to stick me in a sub. And I went, no, that's not happening. So I walked across the hall to the Air Force, and I said, here's my ASVAB scores. And they went, we'll find a place for you. And I ended up part of B-52 Air Crew. That was my FSC. And then halfway through basic, they eliminated that AFSC, which is an MOS for you.
Okay.
And they came back and with you can have a choice of these. And it was clerk and it was motor pool of some sort and law enforcement. And I went, all right, I'll go cop. So I was in the early 80s, security force with the Air Force, went through the same training to a certain point, and then they split security force and law enforcement into two different teams. And one did essentially, USMC, UCMJ training, and the other did air-based ground air-based ABGD, air-based ground defense training. And I went law enforcement. And like I said, that was in the early 80s. I was back in the old days when you still used scraping tickets on slate. And I never got out of San Antonio. I did my entire hitch in San Antonio.
So when so this is, we'll talk history, and then we're going to talk about how your military affects your writing, and then we're going to go on to the book. So one of the things, because I was the college kid in my unit, when the Fort Eustis Transportation Museum for the U.S. Army sent one of their historians, who is in a field of history, and I can't remember the name of it, but basically where they go to important places when important things are happening and record it for posterity with the understanding that they're recording the kind of things a historian later would want to know. As opposed to just news. It's a name for that type of history, and I just can never remember it. And it just would take too long to Google. But I gave him a tour, and we were talking about this because he went on a bunch of gun truck runs with me. I was there for when the 518th gun truck company was shut down and sent back to our units, and it's a whole ordeal. But because of that, we gave him the tour. He said that because everybody was emailing and they weren't actually sending paper mail, you're not going to get any of the letters from the ground. Yeah. Because all of the orders are printed on crap paper. It's not quality like they used to. They've gotten better at making thinner and thinner paper. Between that and the way we do our ink now, they're saying that those papers aren't going to survive. And so a lot of the history is going to get lost because, if you did everything through your email, your AKO or whatever the other branches had, when you get out, they shut that down. That just goes away.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the records are going to get lost, especially the records from the average, person on the ground.
It would make my master's is in knowledge management, which is all about information capture to be actionable by others later. And I think, it might make a really interesting knowledge capture project to go to the dependents of those who are in country and collect emails that were sent in or sent out.
So I signed a release when he was with me, only because he was historian in me. I'm like, let me scan these and I'll batch the ones I don't care you record, because obviously some of this stuff's personal, right?
Sure.
And when you're newlyweds and you're deployed, sometimes the conversation is not what you would want future grandkids to read.
Not simple for the kidlets.
Right. So I was like, let me censor out that stuff. And he's like, I remember being newlywed. And I'm like, other than that, I don't care. Like, when I talk about stuff that happens. And I wrote some letters home because, I had family members that weren't on the internet yet in the 03 and then again in 05. But yeah, it was striking how little of that was going to be able to be saved. And that's where you ended up with like Generation Kill started as a blog. Some of the soldiers did. And then it became, recorded that way. And then people that like made videos. But again, if you didn't back it up and keep up with the constant evolution of various like media platforms and stuff, you might not be, that would be like 100 years from now, them trying to read your VCR when everything's digital.
Well, if the Internet Archive predates that, I'd be willing to bet you could go through the Wayback Machine and find some of that.
No. I'm talking about like the internet stuff is saved, but not most of the individual personal letters like you could get from the average soldier where he wrote his wife or whatever. Most of that isn't going to be there. You're going to get the official stuff and anybody that was posting it on the internet.
Yeah, that's true.
And then whoever they managed to get, because like I said, most people were just either doing phone calls or video chats, or they were doing emails, So, I mean, and then again, before that, I imagine in World War II, they would have killed to be able to actually call home on a semi-regular basis.
Oh, God, yeah.
I don't know if that made it better or worse, though, because you didn't get that shut it off. It'll be there when I get back. Because then all the problems that were at home were your problems there, too. So it's a trade-off.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to see how historians are going to make that out in the coming years.
It will be interesting. All
right, we're going to play the commercial, and then we're going to jump right in. I got a few questions for you, then we're going to talk about the book. So we're going to air that beautiful bean footage.
Humanity will be free, no matter the cost. Deep in the Guatemalan jungle, buried beneath a forgotten Mayan pyramid, an earth-shattering secret sits, waiting. Its discovery will rip apart the illusion that humanity is alone in the universe. Engaged in a life-and-death struggle for the future of mankind, Harry Rogers and Jess Cook are forced to protect this secret from the most despicable foes imaginable. They must race across the globe to complete Liberty Station, the first true interplanetary ship. Only then can they search for the shocking truth behind what they found. They have no room for error, because failure means death for them and subjugation for everyone else. Presenting Liberty Station, Book 1 of Humanity Unlimited, written by Terry Mixon. Purchase your copy on Amazon and learn more about the author and his works at terrymixon.com.
All right. Thank you for sticking with us through that commercial interlude. We do appreciate your patience in that one. And with that out of the way,
and I'm a fan of Terry's. I absolutely love the Empire of Bones series, and I'm really enjoying his Last Hunter series.
I dig that one too. That's got very much anime meets Battlestar Galactica vibes, which I dig.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And the covers just really make it pop, because then you can kind of almost picture it, even though in the uniforms, in the description, sometimes he's kind of low key. Terry's part of that new wave of author who doesn't always describe everything as a style, whereas give me J.R.R. Tolkien, I want to know what every blade of grass looks like. So it's just a style preference. I still love his books. I'm
the same way. I like to give my readers room to work their own imagination.
There's definitely a middle ground where it's like there's a middle ground where you can kind of meet both. It's a hard thing to get because sometimes like you don't know what's important and what's not, and sometimes if you're kind of feeling it out as you write it, I could see both sides. I have a preference, but I read both. So.
Nope, I completely agree.
All right, so
where do you want to go from here?
So you mentioned that you were in the Air Force. So, do you feel like the time you spent in the Air Force affects the ways you tell stories as an author?
My Air Force experience colors it some. My experience of being the son of a Marine colors it some. I don't want to call it hero worship, my awe of my mom's baby brother and the life that Johnny lived colors it a lot. The brown framed on the wall behind me is Johnny's commission as an officer in the Rhodesian Light Infantry. I got a lot of Johnny's papers when he passed. The main character of Genesis Renewed, Dave Sharp, is a high school teacher who also is a Marine who served in the sandbox. Brief aside, my mom and I were having this. We've had this running debate. She keeps trying to tell me that Dave Sharp is me, and I keep telling her, no, it's not, Mom. And I finally snapped. I said, no, Mom, Dave Sharp is a combination of Dad and Johnny. And it stopped her dead. And she went, okay, I can see that. I frequently pick key characteristics from folks from my past and build characters from them. And Dave Sharp is very much the person driven to do right, regardless of it personal cost to him, because that's the way he was raised and what he does.
Okay. So do you draw on people you served with as well?
Not as much. I'm not in touch with many of them. I've been out over 40 years. So those memories have faded quite a bit. But more family members who've served and folks that I've met through them over the years.
Okay, that's fair. So the military has flavored it, but more family military history than specifically your own.
Yeah.
The reason I asked specifically with you, because I kind of knew that was going to be your answer, but I also know that if you're security forces in the Air Force, that's basically MP or cop. And as a cop, you have a lot of interactions with a lot of people, sometimes at their worst, sometimes at their best, but it's always interesting situations.
Yes.
So it definitely means that's one of the MOS fields where you're more likely to end up with those wacky stories than, say, someone who's just a random cook, right?
Yep.
And not to say shenanigans can't happen in the DFAC, but
I will agree with that as well. The security force, the creation of the security force and air-based ground defense came up out of NOM, and the need for base security with the guerrilla warfare that occurred in NOM. The history of the security force is an interesting thing to read. It can be found online. I won't recount it. But it's an interesting read.
Yeah, it's a lot of changes happened after Vietnam. I recommend anyone that's passing through the Tidewater region of Virginia, the Fort Eustis, it's open to the public, the Fort Eustis Transportation Museum. The whole base isn't, but the museum is. It's got the whole history from like when we had wagon carts as the way we transported supplies to, all the way through the Iraq War. The hardest part was when I got back, I took my kids when my youngest was like 4. And I go in there and they have the museum set for the Iraq War. So the second Iraq War, the one I fought in, and I saw people I served with on the wall because they didn't make it, but they were in that space because we escorted convoys. And I'm like, I remember.
I bet that hit the fields.
It did, but I'm just thinking, you never think you're going to live long enough that, especially not when you're at the time I was in my 20s, where you're going to see your friends in a museum because you think, when you think museum, you think ancient, right? Yeah. But because it was relatively current, it was definitely an interesting experience. They also had a exhibit for the first Gulf War with one of the tents that my uncle had been in that was donated to the museum for I forget what it was. It wasn't a match tent. It was just the big barn circus type tents that they used in the first Gulf War, and it was one of the tents that he was in. It was in the museum, which was kind of cool. But he was over there. This totally different experience than mine because when he was going through, he said he went to take a piss away from his vehicle on the advance, and he had like 150 people come up on him. And he's like, "Oh, I'm dead," and they all surrendered to him. And he didn't even have his weapon ready because he was just and then I've heard stories where they were surrendering to like news helicopters in the air that hadn't even landed yet because they're like, "We just want no part of this. Just let us go." So it's interesting to see how that varies. And the weird thing you're going to start seeing as you start getting new fiction, and then we're going to talk about your fiction, but I've noticed it in some of the newer guys that are writing. They want to have the hero have military experience, so they're making him the Gulf War vet, the second Gulf War, right? Because you figure if you fought in the early war, we're in our 40s now and up. And so to hear the old grandpa graybeard guy is the fought my war, I'm like, you know what? Screw you and the horse you rode in on. Because I just encountered that today in a book that I was reading. And I'm like, the old guy was the Iraq war vet. And I'm like, you son of a bitch.
Dude, you're joining the get off my lawn crowd.
Right. I was telling somebody yesterday in the post show that I was taking the kid to church, and I was going to get the door for this one of the younger kids. I'm like, I got the door. Don't worry about it. It's like, no, Daddy says I have to open the door for the old people. And I'm like, it should be allowed to just sucker punch those kids when they say stuff like that.
Right up the back of the head.
Right in the back. Right in the kisser. So it's funny how all that stuff kind of plays in ways you don't think about. So speaking of your service, like obviously you're growing up around the military family in a time you did where you grew up around veterans of the First or Second World War, and then Vietnam as well. I imagine you knew some people that, whether you knew it or not, fought in Korea as well. And based on your age, and I don't mean to be insulting, you probably had some of the old folks when you were little were actually World War I vets.
I had one great uncle that was a World War I vet I never met. No, the oldest service that I had exposure to was my dad's service in the South Pacific. My dad was many years older than my mom. He'd raised a family, and then took on my mom as a single mom and 4 young kids and raised us as his own, and then later adopted us. So, my dad, the man that raised me, was 38 years older than me.
Okay. I know I've listened to some of my aunts and uncles that remember, the extremely elderly, but they remember people that fought in the Spanish-American War that were still around. And people don't like that. Sounds like ancient history until you realize it was like 2020 where the last person receiving a pension from the Civil War died.
Yep.
And so admittedly, that was the disabled kid of a guy who, because, biology is a little bit different for men, and he had a baby at 98. But it's when you start thinking about that, you realize it's not as far back as you thought either.
No,
right?
It's not.
So given your time,
when you start thinking about, the World War II vets are aging out. They're all late 90s and triple digits now. My father-in-law is 94 and served in the 50s. Cold War as part of a bomber squadron with B-36s. And then the Nam generation now is in their 70s, and some of them their early 80s.
If you want to know the air war in World War II, there's Apple Television has Masters of the Air. Have you seen it?
I've heard of it. I haven't taken the time to
It is really good. I paid for Apple TV for a month just to binge watch that whole series. It is good. But it has like when you see what those guys went through, I can understand to a point why my grandfather was like, I was lucky. I was just a grunt in the Bulge, the Battle of the Bulge, and he fought. Obviously, both of my grandfathers fought in World War II, but like you hear them, the ground war in Europe, and they felt lucky because they weren't in the air or they weren't on the island hopping campaigns. And then you look at what they went through, and you're like, well, if they thought the other was bad, you know what I mean? Like, how much worse was it? Although sometimes, is it worse or just different?
Yeah, I mean, you and I should have an offline conversation about my dad's island hopping, because I've got his record, and in those days, you were handed a slip, you got on this ship, you got off at that island, and that's the entire notation in his record. And I went through and worked my way back through it, because when the anniversary of D-Day came up, I went, well, where was Dad? And I went looking through his record. He was at Green Island with his fighter squadron at that point. And then shortly after that, his squadron rotated stateside, and his squadron opened El Toro Naval Air Station down in Irvine, California. and he finished the war there.
And then the weird thing is we're starting to look at, because the tensions with China, and obviously we're not taking a political stance, but this is just factual. Because of the tensions, they're actually looking at reopening some of those air bases that were built by GIs in World War II.
Yep.
On some of the islands. And it's crazy to think about that like they could be landing on an airstrip that, our grandfathers or fathers, in your case, could have potentially built.
Yeah.
It's just amazing to think about. So we talked about like how your service has affected the way you tell stories, yours, your family lore. And I think military families, it sort of does seep into your bones.
It does.
Does it affect the way you engage with content as like a consumer? So as a reader of books, watcher of TV shows, that sort of thing?
It does. It really got to my dad. I was a huge MASH fan as a teen, and my dad hated that show. War is not like that. I said, "Oh, Dad, it's satire." But he could not have it on. Could not be in the same room when it was on. Dad's experience, to the day he passed in 96, could not eat white rice, would not eat white rice, because he still saw it move with maggots, 40 years after the fact. It's, there, and those kind of tidbits, they stick with you. And they become fodder for stories. I spent the majority of my working career in higher ed, and making sure that I engaged with the veteran centers at the various institutions that I was a part of. And I volunteer still, now that I'm retired, at the Veterans Center at Antelope Valley College in Lancaster. And I've gotten involved with the veterans community here. As a matter of fact, they just recently did a 22 ceremony because one of their own lost that fight with his inner voices. And listeners, for those of you who haven't connected those dots, we lose 22 veterans a day to suicide. And that's wrong.
Yeah, I've been to too many funerals that way. I had actually a great uncle who fought as a Marine in the Korea. I was part of the Frozen Chosen, and he told me that when we pulled back, some of the Marines got stuck. But he was from, he grew up in northern Indiana, and so he was used to the snow. So he's like, his group, they just built an igloo to give them shelter and blend in. And they managed, because they happened to have a radio operator with them, they were calling in air supply, trying to get like pallet drops of supplies so they didn't starve. Because I think he was there for a couple days before we could push back through again. And they dropped the pallet, but the wind hit it. And he told me that the container fell off that had all the Tootsie Rolls, because, they had the comfort of home type stuff.
Yeah,
was included in those pallets. Tootsie Rolls and chocolate bars were big. But the main pallet landed too close to the Communist Chinese and the North Koreans, so they got most of the food, and he just got the Tootsie Rolls. And so they lived for a couple days off just Tootsie Rolls and water they heated, and he still couldn't look at a Tootsie Roll again. He said it just made his stomach churn just to look at it.
I'm sure.
And he told some funny stories. Like, he was one of the few Marines that didn't go through basic training, because at that time, Korea is probably the last war where the average country boy fought with a rifle on par with what he hunted with the difference most of the time just being literally the bayonet log at the end. I don't think most people are hunting with like M16s, or I guess the AR-15, which would be the equivalent.
No,
most people aren't hunting with those. And so it was, I think Korea is the last war where the average person was going to war with a rifle very similar to their own hunting rifle at home. Yeah. And so they had so many people volunteering or getting called back that they didn't have room at Parris Island. So they had them. I think it's Camp McCall that's near Parris Island. It's a Marine Corps base. It's an offshoot. I could be wrong on the name. I didn't spend a lot of time or around the Marines. But they had them there waiting for, while they were waiting to start boot camp, they were giving them uniform issues and essentially teaching them how to march while they were waiting. And then because they were all country boys, when they needed to deploy, they just put them on a boat without having gone to basic training on the boat to Korea. And they started you're a gunner, you're the radio operator. They were just giving them MOS in route. And he told stories about the EOD guy, you're EOD, explosive ordnance disposal people, and how they told those people when they were practicing to just stay away from their friends in case they messed it up. They didn't take them with them, and that was their mind clearance, because that was essentially what EOD did back then, right? They were clearing the mines.
My oldest is currently Army active duty EOD.
Yeah, that is a crazy job. Although the EOD told us what we did in Iraq was kind of crazy. You're supposed to call for EOD when you find IEDs, improvised explosive devices. But there weren't as many EOD as there were IEDs, so it was often a wait, and it would get hot, and now you're a sitting target. So we got the bright idea: if we just go back a little bit and then we shoot the bomb and it blows up, then we don't have to wait for EOD, which we started doing, but maybe that wasn't the best for the TBIs it gave some of us, because you can go wrong often enough. And it was always the "am I far enough away" debate when you're sitting there behind the 50 cal getting ready to take a pot shot at this explosive.
No,
my parents live across the street from the guy that was EOD in the Navy with the Seabees, and we told him those stories, and his eyes would get really big, and he goes, "Are you stupid? Did your mom drop you on your head when you were a baby? Like what were you thinking?" And I'm like, "Probably because you know more than me. You knew the risks that we just ignored."
No, he did EOD training. Now is at a joint base in Florida.
Okay.
All major branches do their same training. It's interesting that the Marine Corps and the Navy require a certain number of years in the service before they'll send you to EOD school, but the Army will send you there almost straight out of boot.
Wow. Yeah, it's an interesting MOS field, but it was never an option for me because I'm colorblind. But it was those people had nerves of steel to go out and do that. Because
and my boy growing up, he was one of the impulsive kids, and when my wife raised two and I raised two, I have 4 boys now, and Talon was in high school when his mom and I started dating. That said, we've known each other since high school, and that's another long story. And I got this text from her one day that said, "Rick, what's EOD?" And I thought about it for a second, and I sent back, "Well, the Air Force classifies it as explosives, ordnance, and disposal." "Why?" She says, "Talon enlisted." Oh, okay. And he graduated high school, and 2 or 3 days later, he was off to boot.
Wow.
And you can't hope for anything more than for your kids to love what they do. And he absolutely loves what he does. He's the senior NCO with the EOD unit at a base out here in the desert, and absolutely loves what he does.
Someone's got to do it. I was happy just walking and shooting, light infantry all the way. And for all of you airborne pukes who are listening, leg lights do matter. Shut up. With that out of the way.
You tell them, Leg. You tell them.
That's right. Lawn darts are still just grunts when they hit the ground. And slow-moving targets, if you will. But so, obviously, now we want to talk about only an hour and 10 minutes in, but I was having too much fun.
I'm sorry.
In our defense, we were left.
I can go for hours, brother.
Well, like I said, in our defense, we were left unsupervised. So it's really the Garber's fault for having family plans. Date night, schmate night. They should have hung out with us.
Absolutely.
So
absolutely.
We're here, and as we talk about it, I'm going to throw the cover up. But we're here to talk about.
I'll bring it up. Here it is.
Oh, okay. Well, hold on. I'll let you show your copy real quick. Solo layout. It looks. Oh, is that hardcover?
No, paperback.
Okay. For a second, the way the light hit it, I thought maybe it was a hardcover.
6x9 glossy.
Okay. But so first off, what is the elevator pitch if you're got someone cornered and you want to tell them about the Genesis Renewed saga?
Genesis Renewed is a post-apocalyptic pandemic saga that is centered largely in Central and Northern California. Its protagonist is a high school history teacher who falls back on his Marine Corps training, because we all do that. In the event of an emergency, the things that are drummed into us are the things we fall back on. And you fall back on family and security, securable perimeter, and move forward from there. The pathogen is celestial in origin and has a mortality rate of 6 zeros to the right of the decimal and then a 3. which means your survival population in Northern California is a little over 20,000 people. And survival is a genetic marker that they find later on. And you start making familial bonds. It's a story that germinated in my head back in late 2004. And I played with for a while and stuck in a drawer, and then pulled out again and played with a while and stuck in a drawer. And as I was getting ready to retire, I pulled it out and dusted it off and did a page one rewrite. If you'll remember, your From the Ashes anthology had one of my short stories in it, Iceroid Survivor. That's set in the same universe.
Okay. And because we do have some families that listen, what would you say, like, if we'll just use the movie rating because it's easy, what would you say the rating for this series is?
I would say at a minimum PG-13, probably NC-17.
Or why NC-17?
Early pages have some not suitable for kids scenes.
Okay, because of the pandemic at the beginning?
No, because of the evil that men do.
Fair. So it starts post-apoc, right as the end happens.
Yep.
Is it just a man versus nature story of survival? What would you say the series in a nutshell is?
The series is fighting for survival with the fading legacy of technology that remains because of the speed of the dial. And what do you try and preserve? How hard do you try and preserve it? What do you try and retain and maintain? Dave Sharp has this notion of, I know what the numbers are. I found, the CDC articles. And in order for mankind to survive, we need to gather because we need a genetic pool. Right. There are several articles out there about a projection of a die-off as a result of the supervolcano explosion 70,000 years ago. And the projections are that worldwide humankind dropped to about 10,000. This takes the same kind of rapid die-off. So how do you move forward, not only as a family and a community of survivors, but mankind in general? And what do you do to try and gather? And to that end, what do you do by way of governance? What do you build? What do you retain? What do you let go?
That is always...
Where does the rule of law fit in?
That is the interesting thing about the post-apoc genre, is facing the fact that, humanity is largely a modern construct that fades away very quickly. Humanity is 3 meals away or 3 days away from being primal again. And then as we got more technologically savvy, which would affect your book, most stores, they don't have like huge warehouses in the back. It's a parts delivered quickly kind of model, supplies delivered quickly. They have 3 days worth of food in a grocery store for the average community it serves. So you shut that down, and very quickly it gets brutal.
Sure.
People are hungry, and the big cities are going to be the worst.
Not to go too deep into spoilers, I mean, this book's been out a year and a half now. Their first move is to Vandenberg because of supplies and defensible location and other things, and discover a fictional self-feeding power station where they've got a hydrogen generation facility feeding a hydrogen massive fuel cell to serve the base. So then they have energy, so they have control over their environment. But that doesn't go quite as they hope it plans. And then they make the next move. All right, so we need energy to have control over our environment. Where's the next logical step? And the next step they follow is geothermal. So they move to Northern California and take advantage of the geyser fields and the geothermal plants up there.
Okay. So did you have to
if you have electricity and if you have control over that, you have considerable control over your environment. And you build from there.
It gets interesting because the way we build affects that too. It used to be like, okay, so here's the thing. Everyone is a historian, as you know that because you're a history nerd. Everyone has this mistaken belief that people in the past were significantly shorter than us. Some of that is true because they were malnourished, but largely that comes from a matter of perspective when you look at the buildings and the beds and whatnot, because one of two things. The clothes that survive generally are the extremes, because the really small side of the scale and the really large side of the scale, you didn't have as many people to use them. Everything else, you used it till it wore out. You didn't just throw it away. And so if you brought your uniform home from the Civil War, wasn't that different than what they would have worn at home on the farm. They literally wore it until it fell apart.
Yep.
And if it didn't fall apart with them, they passed it on to someone else who did, so it didn't survive, which, that means what's left clothing-wise skews. And then you don't realize that at a certain point in time in history, we actually thought it was healthier to sleep at an incline. And so most beds were designed where you're going to sort of sleep at a reclining 45. Factor in ceilings were higher because they were designed to circulate air for natural cooling because they didn't have centralized air. Those buildings would actually, like, if the apocalypse happened now, I'm going to like a historic house because I'm not going to sweat as much, as opposed to these closed off, boxes we call modern homes that only work if you've got central air forcing circulation. And so it's definitely something to think about when you talk about like what power does for you.
Yeah, no, I've had several folks who read a lot of the post-apoc stuff shoot me notes and say, I like what you did here, the realistic treatment, throwing in the science, throwing in the actual function and things breaking. I pat myself a little on the back for trying to construct a world in that fashion.
How much did you have to spend researching it versus how much did you already know?
Probably an even mix. I grew up, the son of a Marine was also a machinist. So I grew up in a very hands-on mechanical fix-it-yourself household. I learned to turn a wrench as a kid. So internal combustion engine, gasoline, small engine repair, electricity, electrical wiring, electrical generation, fabrication, lathes, mills, CNCs. Those are all things I grew up in around. So the very mechanical, tactile, material management kind of things were all part of my world. So I can draw on that. Add to that my military experience and law enforcement exposure, handled the weapons exposure and the availability and where you might find it. Some of the tactical stuff, I draw on some of the stories from my uncle, the helicopter pilot. I talked to him a couple of different times, picking his brain. So could somebody actually teach themselves to fly a UH-1 if it were available? And Jim went, yeah, flying it a trained chimpanzee can do. It's the takeoff and landing that's really rough. And I went, so if I had all of the procedures and manuals and a semi-eidetic memory, I could do it. And he went, yeah, you could probably work your way through it. So I take advantage of that. I have the resource. I picked my uncle's brain.
Convenient.
So, and that turns around with my former Marine history teacher teaches himself to fly a UH-1 to go looking for survivors.
So how do you factor in, or do you factor in, well, first off, how far after the collapse is your story set?
Oh, the story starts right there. This story starts within a week or two of the die-off happening, and runs from there. So you think about, power generation and other things, depending upon the manner of generation and the source of electricity. He starts out in Northern California. A significant portion of the electricity in the Marin Sonoma area comes from geothermal. So he's aware of that, and that factors into his world starting out. But he then rapidly makes the run south for family reasons and then returns north later. You draw on what you know. I lived in Northern California for several years. I grew up on the Central Coast. I grew up an hour and change from Vandenberg. So you draw on what you know.
Most people don't realize when they do post-apoc, they just, we're going to mine that car for gas. And they don't realize that gas has a shelf life.
It has a shelf life. So does ASGAS, aviation fuel.
Yep. And because I escorted convoys in Iraq, I learned a lot about the 18-wheeling industry.
And
Some of them,
diesel has different shelf lives than gasoline.
absolutely. And they also have machines that keep the gas from stagnating and thus settling. And if you don't have power, that doesn't happen, and it could go bad faster. Most canned goods
to be airtight.
Everyone thinks canned goods could last, 20, 30 years because we grew up hearing canning and we're not realizing that was canned in a different way. Modern canned goods, 5-year shelf life max.
Yep.
Fridges are going to go out pretty quickly. Without power, that's going to start spoiling and bringing diseases.
Yep.
And so people don't.
If you have power, you have control over your environment to a certain extent.
But people don't often know that kind of stuff because they're so spoiled that they never think those things. So unless the person writing the post-apoc does their research or just knows, you read it and like, oh, they didn't do any research because that's not how that works.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
I've seen that happen in a couple of the post-apoc genre books that I've read. So do they end up, is this like, obviously it's man versus nature. Do they defeat the plague, or is that just fait accompli?
The population of the world is what it is. And you have a genetic immunity. And the story carries through to him making the decision that he's going to make every effort to find other survival groups and try and build colonies to try and enable humanity's survival.
So obviously if it's genetic based, it's a crapshoot. So there's not necessarily everyone centralized together.
Absolutely.
Do you factor in like what that, and did you think about how that might work? Like, will it contaminate animals, which they would rely on for food, and like that kind of thing?
Handful of species that die off with the pathogen as well. I identify a couple of survivor colonies based upon ethnicities and connections there. And then one of my survivors is a geneticist, although her original area of expertise was AIDS research. She shifts that and works through trying to identify the markers, because one of the early questions is, okay, we survived, but can we create offspring? Are we it? Or can we have future generations? And that's another one of the things that carries on through a couple or three novels in this series.
That's interesting. Yeah, the kids thing. I hadn't really thought of that. That's definitely something to consider when you look at that.
Yep.
Do you factor in, is that something that comes up? Because if you have this mass die-off, that's a lot of bodies. Bodies bring their own level of suck and disease that just because you're immune to the virus doesn't mean you're immune to that.
And yep, nope, that's all part of it too.
So
I would be interested in your take. I'll send you a copy if you're interested in reading.
I will. I'll do a review of it for Upstream. I write reviews for them. I'm curious, how did you handle like ships out to sea when this happened? Planes that might have been in the sky? Like,
the die-off happens over a period of about a week.
Okay.
So it's not immediate. If you remember from the Asteroid Survivors, that story concludes with the pathogen hitting the atmosphere and a couple of days after that. So the pathogen hits the atmosphere and it's a space of about 10 days to 2 weeks. And you have what you have by what's left of population.
Okay. And that's the other thing then it starts to look at, like, not just that the population dies off, but certain skilled trades are going to potentially die off.
Absolutely.
And it's everyone thinks, for instance, they'll give me you were in the infantry, you must know everything about guns. And I'm like, well, you drive a car. Do you know how a combustion engine works? I know. They gave me the rifles I had. I knew those rifles and I knew how to shoot them well. That doesn't make me a gun expert, and I won't pretend that I am.
I know how to strip and clean a 16.
Absolutely.
I know how to strip and clean a Model 92. Beyond that, let's talk.
I can strip and clean the pig, the M60. I can strip and clean and set the headspace and timing on the 50 cal. I didn't mess with much else.
Yep.
So it's one of those things that people often don't think about, because if you're having mass die-offs, what if the only doctor you had that could, treat your boo-boos was one of the ones that died? Because,
what if there's no doctor?
Or no doctor.
What if your medical crew is a Navy Reserve nurse and a kid who was pre-med?
It gets complicated, and the more, the hits just keep on coming. So it's essentially a survival story. Do they end up having to go to war with themselves? Because in crisis, people turn on each other. How feral does it get?
Without going too deep into spoilers, the first 3 novels, they don't have a lot of infighting. They have some moral disagreements and philosophical arguments, but there's no internal infighting. The clash external comes from, other survivors, and like I said, the evil that men do.
That is the essentially you'd go back to a more primitive tribal kind of vibe, and so sometimes tribes war with each other for resources.
Yep.
It's
and Dave is protector. Dave is gatherer and protector and sees himself as that.
And then the other thing is,
puts himself in the position in some cases as judge, jury, and executioner as well.
And then you look at food, because at a certain point in time, you can't rely on continually scrounging canned goods, which means you're going to have to figure out, someone's going to have to learn how to field dress an animals, game.
And teach themselves agriculture.
And that's the other part, is farming. And I can tell you that because when the COVID stuff happened, I decided I was going to start a victory garden just because, you had time, right? And I've been doing that every year since 2020, and I've yet to have a successful crop.
Yeah.
It's a live and learn experience. And it's still a hobby. I'll keep doing it. But there's something therapeutic about bringing new life in when you had to take lives. So that's why I do it. But I keep thinking, if I applied that on a larger scale, how many other people with black thumbs like I do are going to try to grow things and realize they can't?
Yeah. And I have the opposite experience. My maternal grandmother's line, my great grandparents immigrated as farmers from Poland and had a dairy farm in upstate New York. My grandmother could put anything in the ground and it would grow. Anything.
I come from dairy farmers too, and I still couldn't manage.
and I got that as well. I can turn soil and stick something in the ground and it will grow.
And some of it's just a matter of you make mistakes, you don't think about it. So I'll use myself. I did bucket gardens, which means you drill a hole towards the bottom. So you got rain. The first year I didn't do that, so I got rot. Second year I'm like, okay, well, let me draw a hole, and then none of the water stuck, so I got dry rot. The third year I'm like, well, let me add gravel to the bottom. Yeah. And I got mold. And then last year I tried something different and it didn't work. And then I finally went and I'm like, let me ask the expert, because you got garden clubs. And they're like, yeah, because you didn't put the drainage holes up high enough, idiot. I'm like, oh. And I'm just thinking, if you didn't have someone, and it's not just knows how to grow, it knows how to grow in your region.
Yeah.
And so that if you don't have that, the trial and error, which will happen, is going to cause problems. Did you factor in with that the issue that a lot of the companies that make the seeds now are selling? I forget the term for it, but they don't produce seeds themselves, so you have to keep going back and buying new ones.
I don't remember the term for that. No, I didn't factor that in.
Because if you,
yeah, I know, Monsanto and several of the others are running that. You have to buy your seed every year instead of growing for your own seed. I didn't factor that in.
Because that would be another issue. Even if you have people with seeds, are the seeds going to produce a crop that can sustain itself year after year or not? There is a movement to go the other direction, to say, screw that, we're going to do it ourselves. The difference is those special seeds that don't produce seeds with what they grow tend to be resistant to the various things, which is why they're popular. So it's a crapshoot, But if that's what you have in an apocalypse, well, holy crap, I don't have season 2.
Yeah, you're also running into, at least I've heard, issues of drift. So you have genetically modified one field and traditional on the other, and there's a cross-pollination that occurs with some, and it impacts the capacity to germinate future generations as they happen with the more traditional seed. I've heard and read stories along that line as well, articles and such.
Yeah,
But no, I didn't dive that deep. The farming that occurs in Genesis Renewed takes over an existing dairy farm
okay.
with an alfalfa crop in the field that's been trampled. So they pull from that to seed out the next one and take advantage of nursing cattle for milk and other things to continue that cycle. So in essence, I guess I could say I cheated on that one a little.
I mean, it's not unless you grow up around farms. Like I've been to the family dairy farm in northern Indiana. So like when some of my relatives found out I wanted a homestead, they're like, "Oh, would you like to come take over the cattle farm?" I'm like, "There's a big difference between a homestead and a cattle farm."
Oh yeah.
But you realize how much goes into it that the average person doesn't think about. They don't know where their food comes from.
Yeah.
And so when you start looking at like the major issue you're going to run into, and this is especially important in the post-apocalyptic genre, is how much of the farming is monocrop based that's designed for, like, we grow corn for the ethanol because they get subsidies from the government, or they let their fields fallow because they get subsidies from the government. And so they're not actually growing food that you eat because you can only eat so much corn.
Yep.
Which means you're going to have that, even if you time the crisis where it's right as the crops grow, that doesn't guarantee that first year you're going to get anything you can eat. And then again, coming up with the seeds for year two of edible, stuff. So that is every time you think you know everything you need for post-apocalypse, you learn something else. And like, oh, I didn't factor that in.
Oh yeah.
You just don't know what you don't know.
There's always something. This one, Genesis Renewed, takes place in Northern California. The next book in the series, Oaths and Odysseys, picks up where this one leaves off. That dropped this past July.
Okay.
The third book that I'm working on is actually a paraquel, which runs parallel to Genesis Renewed in timeline, but its primary character is in the middle of BFE nowhere, Saskatchewan.
Okay.
Because if you take the same premise of America and population and the numbers and run it against the numbers of Canada, instead of, you end up with, 100 people alive spanning the nation of Canada. And if it's a genetic immunity, then, a survivor in a little town outside Regina in Saskatchewan. And if you take that, college kid with no life skills and you leave him in the middle of nowhere, Saskatchewan, I think that makes for an interesting story.
Absolutely. That would be interesting. And then other places are going to get hit harder because, immunities that are genetic based are going to have some racial component to it, or at least ethnic, if not racial, which I mean, like, there's a lot of overlap in those terms, but
absolutely.
But that means you're going to get clusters of a lot of people more than normal, and then other areas where it'll be completely barren.
I take advantage of my son, his degrees are in anthropology and archaeology. So I pick his brain a little. I have a couple of friends who are professors in anthropology and in, oddly enough, Native American literature.
Okay.
And pick their brains as well. And there are a couple of North American tribes that are really quite old, genetically old.
Right.
And I tag into one of them in having a larger than anticipated population of survivors, specifically in the second book. And it drives part of the story.
The other thing is, with that many people dying, there's going to be a lot of corpses for animals to eat that are predators. And so you will see a rapid spike in, like, wolves. If you're in an area with bears and lions, you're going to see spikes in those because there's suddenly going to be a glutton food.
Mountain lions, yep. Coyotes, yep.
Which is going to be good and bad because it's going to mean...
And large dogs.
And large dogs, it's going to mean that there's food at first, but it's also going to mean as that population grows, they're going to become more aggressive because they're going to be searching for the food that they glutted themselves on that's not there, which means human settlements are going to be at risk if they can't defend themselves.
Yep.
And eventually you run out of bullets, which means you've got to go primitive. Bow and arrow, black powder, if you know how to make it,
There's an awful lot of ammunition out there stored around, especially if
Ammunition
you try and tap into military installations that no longer have a population on them.
true, but they also have shelf lives. Those bullets do.
They do, but depending upon storage, that shelf life is considerable.
It is, but again, it depends on optimal situations.
True.
And if everyone disappears, the chances of catastrophic events happening in those buildings that might prematurely set stuff off, fires that'll run. I mean, lightning strike alone
Absolutely
could destroy a whole town that you can't loot anymore because the fire spread.
The poor kid in Genesis alone deals with a lot of fire because things are left alone.
And that's the other thing that people don't realize. I learned it when I was looking for house shopping, but modern homes are not designed to sit empty. They don't do very well when they're empty because you don't have people maintaining the temperature and whatever, which they end up more susceptible to molds and stuff.
Yep.
And with that, all of these houses that are now empty, they're going to become easier to burn over time, or death traps of viruses, molds and whatnot. Because black mold is prevalent, especially if you're in a humid area.
You're absolutely right. Black mold and mildew, absolutely.
So how would you describe the main character in this book, the history teacher? What is his name, and how would you describe him?
Well, his name is Dave Sharp, and he is the favorite history teacher at the high school. He is engaged. He's interested in the kids. He's interested in learning. He has more or less left his past life behind, and struggles with the notion of being thrust back into that role of gunnery sergeant with a recon unit, with having to deal with security, defensible position, and being thrust back into the role of protector in many ways, certainly of his family, but then into the role of protector for other survivors that he comes across. And his internal struggles deal with his past and his past lives, and the role that he does not want, but is stuck with by virtue of the world that he's now in, and the need to protect those he loves and those he's come into the role for. He's in many cases, every Marine I know is a dedicated patriot, and to that end, you fight again with what do we keep, what do we preserve, and what do we let go aside when we go about building the next society, and he struggles with that.
So were there any secondary characters that you thought were pretty memorable for you as you were writing?
Oh, I've had some fun with some secondary characters. The nurse, Dana Rojas, is a feisty Valley girl who went into the Navy to escape her family and the Valley, and then suddenly finds herself in the position of having to come back to take care of her baby sister, and ends up in a very tough situation. I loved writing the rabbi, who is the head of a survivor family. He is a Korean War vet and retired Army chaplain, and becomes the conscience of the colony. Benjamin was a lot of fun to write. There is a very mysterious character in book one who goes by the name of Decht, and it turns out is a lone survivor of our intelligence community, and the interactions between he and Dave were a lot of fun to write.
So given the kind of torment you put your main character through. If you met him in a dark alley, is he going to murder you, or are you going to be able to be okay?
Oh, I'd have his back, and I'd want his, because he would first and foremost try and find a way to move away from it. But if thrust into it, you don't fight because there are rules. You fight to win.
So, and this is on a little bit of a tangent. Did you watch the show The Last Ship? It was a series. It got like 4 or 5 seasons.
I read the book.
I didn't know it was a book.
The book is fabulous. I can grab it. It's right there.
So I watched a couple episodes before I cut cable, so I haven't seen the whole thing. But the basic premise is, in an apocalypse, the commander of these ships at sea that weren't affected by everything, what happens to them? And I'm thinking in that kind of situation, submarines are contained, because you mentioned that earlier. Submarines are contained environmental systems, so the chances of, if they were underwater when everything hit the fan, they might not be exposed. So that becomes another thing to factor in too. It might be interesting as a storyline.
What's the name of that story? Shoot. Neville Shute. It came out in the 50s. It was a movie with Fred Astaire and a bunch of other folks in it. But the main character is a naval sub captain with a sub that ends up in Australia, northern hemisphere nuclear exchange, and the cloud ultimately starts making its way south. I wish I could remember the name of it. Good read, and a pretty good movie. The problem with the sub cycle and that solution is supplies. You ultimately have to resupply. And that's the same thing that happens with The Last Ship. You ultimately have to resupply.
Submarines, though, nuclear submarines specifically, they run out of food before they'll ever run out of power.
Oh, absolutely.
And you've got months of food on those ships. So it would depend on how early into their cruise cycle they were.
Yeah.
But given how quickly you said your pandemic happened, the odds are they were able to ride it out. Of course, once they're exposed to the virus, they're going to have the same percentage of die-off risk. But that gives interesting of what happens to them as they come up and the world is just different. It'd be an interesting.
On the Beach is the name of the novel.
Okay. I will have to check that out.
It's a really good read.
All right. I'll throw that in the show notes so people can check it out. But yeah, so
highly recommend The Last Ship as a read. Very good read.
And then there's a show that came out called Revolution. Now, it's a different world-ending apocalypse type event. This one was essentially all the technology just stopped working because plot reasons. And then what happened. But I thought it did a pretty good job. For all there were plot holes, it did a pretty good job showing what society looks like when all modern technology stops working. And you ended up with primitive sort of pre-Civil War style societies, black powder rifles, because the ability to get new rounds. I mean, eventually you'll run out.
Yeah.
And then those that did have rounds of the modern stuff were hoarding it and not letting the rank and file get it because guns are power in that kind of situation. But that level of like what happens to the country is an interesting take. And essentially most people posit in the scenarios you're describing, countries cease to exist, tribes will become king, and you'll get city states essentially.
Yeah.
That's
where the Genesis Renewed world is going to go ultimately. He gravitates towards trying to preserve what he defended, but the reality is that country, that world no longer exists. So you take the values of it and you build anew.
And that is often a sticking point in post-apocalyptic genre books, whereas like how do you adjust to the newness? Because in theory, you were taught, not to kill. Most people believe that's what the Bible, they'll say new translations mean it actually meant murder, which is totally different, and just war concept and all that. I said that to say, like the idea that I might have to shoot him because if it's him or me, I don't want to die. It's a huge transition, and those that can't make it just don't exist anymore. And so you end up with a society that is irrevocably changed, even if you solve the thing and you try to go back to normal, the people aren't ever going to be the same again.
Yep. And that is another one of the realities that Dave and other survivors struggle with. The believing in the rule of law, but being thrust into defender and as such judge, jury, and executioner.
Yeah. And then it's a lot to think about. Now, the other part of that is you also have a cultural, almost PTSD type deal, because like everybody went through trauma of this, like everybody lost somebody.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're going to end up with people in shell shock, which means that because the survival part, while they struggle to get that figured out, they're going to be in shock. But eventually when things hit normal, reality hits about all of that. And you're going to see some emotional consequences for society as well.
And in the world that I've written, many of them struggle with this notion of the world died and suddenly I'm back in suburbia. What the fuck?
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I've heard speculated as why, because when my Gulf War was, soldiers started coming home and PTSD rates were high. I heard some of the old timers. I actually had someone at my local VA tell me our war didn't count because he was a Korean war vet Vietnam war vet, and not to come. We weren't welcome. They obviously that is not the prevailing opinion of the VFW now, but I mean we're talking circa 2006. But I was going somewhere with this. Shoot. Oh, one of the things they talked about is the reason that the PTSD was higher in modern veterans versus some of the older ones is that because we deployed the way we did, where a soldier from here or there because of the guard units and active duty, it wasn't like the whole town went, because the percentages of who joined now were so low that when you came home, you didn't have anyone that experienced it with you. So you always had that reference to turn to, like at Vietnam or World War II, Korea, your neighbor likely was there. So you had that comfort. Yeah. Whereas
World War II, where, everybody knew somebody, and entire towns in some cases served.
Which means that this group is going to be less susceptible only because everybody they're going to be dealing with is experienced the exact same thing. So it's an interesting psychological question that nobody has answers to.
No, it's fun to write.
Absolutely.
There's Max Brooks, Mel Brooks' kid,
right?
Is effing brilliant. I don't know if you've read any of his stuff. World War Z is an after-action report for the zombie apocalypse, and brilliantly written. And the audiobook is cast with voices that you will recognize immediately. But he is a fellow with the War College and has been brought in specifically to get folks to think outside the box. And there's a YouTube video. I'll see if I can find it. I'll send you a link of him talking about the warrior class that's being developed now within our society, because only 3% of our population has served in any capacity. And even a smaller portion of that has seen combat. And as a result, they're becoming their own cloistered little, it's just a really interesting thought process that he goes through. And if you find that, it's real interesting listening.
And the other part of that is that culture, I see that a lot when people review military sci-fi, and they always want to harp on the military culture because that's not what it was like when I was in. And given that I was in pre 9/11, then during the 9/11 event, then early Global War on Terror or GWOT, and then as it wound down, like every one of those increments was a different culture. I remember when people went to drill weekends and they drank beer and had cookouts, and that was the extent of it, and that it was a good old boys club. Well, then the war happened, and suddenly they had to know their job or die, and it changes the culture. And so the idea of the military culture is also going to be generational and cyclical, because in the 80s and 90s, it was about that warrior mentality. It was all about the Native Americans. When I was in, it was all about the Viking mystique. So it was Until Valhalla and all of that. Call signs of like Valkyrie and Norse. I wonder how much Marvel with Odin and Thor played into that.
Oh, I'm sure it did.
But all of that means that every era, and sometimes not just era, but what you did in the military is going to give a different flavor to the culture too.
Well,
which,
for my personal experience, the spectrum of my experience and I had serious conversations with my dad about this before going in. His experience in basic military training boot at Parris Island in the 40s, very different than boot in the 80s and very different than boot now. And I had the advantage of my dad imparting to me his experiences in boot, so that when I'm in boot in San Antonio at Lackland in the 80s, they didn't get to me with any of the head games that I saw some of the other guys fall to, because I knew they were coming and I knew the outcomes they were looking for. And then, conversations with my kid when he served and when he went through. Again, very different experiences. The spectrum changes because the level of conflict evolves and the population associated with it is very different. So you don't have the community to fall back on. I've spent, I don't know how many afternoons sitting and talking to what I call kids, but many of them in their 30s and 40s now, who served in the Gulf, and their experience. My personal experience was all peacetime. The closest thing I ever saw to combat was going to the range to qualify.
And then the later Gulf War or Iraq War II, their experience was vastly different than mine. Mm-hmm. When the initial invasion happened in the first few years, where it was a lot more kinetic, I think is a polite way to say it. Yeah. And so theirs was more policing action instead of a lot of frontline combat. And I'm not taking away anything they did, but their experience wasn't mine. When I went there, the green zone was like, holy crap, I hope I don't have to do that mission because it's dangerous as hell. And then a couple years later, I watched people with no guns, no armor, nothing, standing out there re-enlisting in the green zone. And I'm just, holy crap, that was a death trap when I was there.
And it's an important perspective to have. And I have heard multiple folks say, a fellow by the name of Dennis Anderson, who was a reporter and went and got a degree, and now he's a vet counselor. He and I have had a couple of conversations on this, that no matter what your experience is, and this seems to be pervasive now, no matter what your experience is, if you stood up, you took the oath, you raised your hand, and you stood a post, you served and you're revered. That wasn't always the case, especially in the 70s and 80s.
Right.
When, the folks who served in uniform were still considered baby killers coming out of Nam.
Yeah, sadly.
So, I don't want to say it's a good time to be a vet. That's not what I'm trying to say, but it's a different world, and it's critical to remember everybody's experience is personal in the world that they experienced, and you need to give folks that level of A, respect, and B, credit for what they did.
Absolutely. And it's
and I'll get off my soapbox now. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. It's just all of that changes perspective. And so you're going to see some of that because everyone that survives your apocalypse, because I'm trying to keep this back to, there's a lot of overlap in warfare and the psychology thereof and a post-apoc, because it's all the trauma, right? And so the people that are all survivors are going to be dealing with that together, which either it's going to drive them crazy and apart, or it's going to bring them together closer than anything. But it's also going to create that tribal mentality, because those other guys over there, they're not us. They didn't keep me alive when, everything was wonky. These people here, though, they were the ones that, together we survived.
Yep.
And it's going to create a return to that. You're going to end up with, like, what is that, Lord of the Flies, essentially.
And we go through a couple of cycles with that in this and in a subsequent book.
And I still think they did Piggy wrong. I'm just saying, if you read the book, they did that poor kid wrong. But yeah, that's the fun thing I think about post-apoc, and I just added it because of you, and I put your name on it. I've voluntold you. We're going to do a panel on post-apoc next month. We'll record it because there's so many there's so many ways this affects, and on the one hand, depending on what the apocalypse is, the results will be different. But there's some of it that it's all going to be the same when stuff hits the fan. Like there's going to be some levels of commonality. And the city kids have it the worst because the learning curve is going to be the steepest.
No survivor skills.
No survivor skills, and you're going to end up with no resources. I mean, there's a reason when stuff got bad, they closed the bridges and locked New York City to itself.
Yep.
And it gets feral and cannibal pretty quickly, I would suspect.
I think you're right.
And a lot of people that were raised on television and video games, and you can punch a cop with almost no consequences because it's political as opposed to just law and order based. When reality of survival hits, those people not accustomed to the consequences of their actions, it's going to get ugly because you're going to punch somebody and think, well, he can't hit me back because insert reason. Some of those people are going to start hitting you back and not going to care.
And you'll catch a bullet and it'll be all over.
Yeah, I mean it gets weird, but we want to end on a positive note.
Absolutely. What do you got?
So, what good things survived in your apocalypse that they can look forward to?
What good survived? That's interesting. This book ends up on an upbeat with Dave making the decision that his search for survivors needs to continue and needs to broaden. And they start reaching out to communities that they've discovered and trying to gather. And the second book goes into Oaths and Odysseys, cycles down into, all right, if we're going to do this, what kind of rule of law do we need to develop? Do we need a constitution? How are we going to structure this? And because he's the de facto leader, he appoints a group and says, okay, this is your job now. You figure out what we're going to build.
Yeah, and it gets like a lot of the cultures largely, even if ethnically and culturally the people aren't, a lot of the culture that develops after is going to be largely affected by their environment, because how you survive in northern Washington state is going to be different than how you would survive on the panhandle of Florida, just by nature of geography and geology.
Absolutely. Like I said, I had a lot of fun writing this book, and I have a lot of fun writing with the characters. I take a little license with the longevity of technology and the ability to tap it and exercise it, but not too much, because I know enough about it. I was a technologist in higher ed for 30 years, and I'm now a consultant in that field. So I know the computing world. I know a bit about the satellite and spy satellite world. I know a bit about the backbones and communications technology. So I take advantage of that as well as the ability to tap my uncle, the pilot, to pick his brain.
Okay, so as we bring this to a close, you mentioned in the pre-show that you are going to, so this is going to air first week of October. In case you didn't know, dear listener, we generally record the episode you're listening to a month in advance. So when you're listening to one in October, it was likely recorded in September, sometimes more, but that's the goal we try to keep, is about a month ahead. So we're recording this in September, and you've got an event coming up that you wanted to talk about that will be happening soon. So can you tell us about that?
I do. I've been very lucky. There's a women's group women's club in Santa Barbara, California, that I've managed to become connected with. And I've been invited back a couple of times to their book club as an author and an indie author to talk about both the field of indie authorship, but also my stories. I've been back twice. I'm going to be back again in October, on October 8th at 2:00. I'll be at the Women's Club in Santa Barbara talking about my latest novel, which is Oaths and Odysseys. I'll be doing a reading from it and talking about, again, my experience as an indie author and what I've learned over the last year and change since the last time I was there. So if you're in the Central Coast area, consider this an open invitation to find your way to the Women's Club Book Club at the Santa Barbara Women's Club in Rocky Nook Park in Santa Barbara, California at 2:00 on October 8th.
Okay, and I will get a link to them.
You can
From
find.
you.
I've got an event linked on my Facebook page that you can certainly repost with all of the information.
All right, and we'll get you to repost that there, but we'll also include it in the show notes. So we'll go from there. And with that, what are you writing now?
I am working on the third book, as I mentioned earlier, third book in this world. Working title is Genesis Alone. And it's a college student in the middle of BFE nowhere, Saskatchewan, trying to figure out how to survive.
Okay, so this is the part of the interview, dear listener, where I remind you to please be kind and speak your mind on the reviewing platforms. Your reviews help the right readers find the right book, and it really does matter. So do your part, leave a review. It especially helps independent authors who have very little marketing to grab the algorithm support to get their books out there to other people. And so I encourage you to leave those reviews. They really do help. Remember, when you're writing them, you're talking to other readers. Some authors don't even read them. They're just, it's too hard on their fragile egos. No judgment, but just, write what you tell your fellow reader. That's how reviews should work about a various books. With that, all of his links will be in the show notes. You can find us on our Linktree, linktr.ee, Linktree/Blasters and Blades Podcast. Again, Linktree/Blasters and Blades Podcast, where we link to all the things: the BitChute, the Rumble, the YouTube, the TikToks, the Twitters, the Blasters and Blades Facebook group and Facebook page. Our email, blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com. Again, blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com. For professional purposes only, send all the shenanigans to Madam Stabby Stab on the Instagram, Twitter, and the email. And if you're listening to this episode, we recently had proof of life on Stabby, so she's still around. We have our website, which is linked in this link tree as well. A bunch of gobbledygooks. Don't blame me, blame Spotify. But if you go to that website, you can support the show for as little as 99 cents a month. You can help keep the lights on. Every penny helps, and we do appreciate your patronage. Or you can support the show more directly at buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Again, buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Be sure to put in the comment section that is for the podcast, and I promise I will keep my co-host duly caffeinated. If you do that, you could also support the show by going to the Coffee Brand Coffee link. Use our link. You get 10% off. We get a little bit of a kickback. Right now, I'm using my own drugs, so I'm one of my best customers on the Coffee Brand Coffee. You too can join my addiction club and buy some of your own and get 10% off. It's an American-made company, or American-made. It's an American company. They roast the beans in America. They employ American citizens. It is not a drop shipping operation. And it wherever you live, I encourage you to shop local. It's better for the environment and better for the economy local to you. Sometimes that means local is just your nation as opposed to whatever. And so if you're in the U.S., I encourage you to do that. If you're not in the U.S. and you're a coffee addict, find someone that roasts it local. It's better for you. And with that, my soapbox has ended. Thank you for spending some of your precious time with us. For my crazy and absentee co-host, I am J.R. Handley, and this was the Blasters and Blades Podcast. We'll be back next week at the same time, where we'll indulge our love of nerd culture, cheesy jokes, and all things that go boom. And with that, we're out. Wait for it.
So much.